Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, for those who just joined, I'm Sam Oliker-Friedland. I lead the Institute for Responsive Government, and thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern to talk about policy, specifically ranked choice voting. This is part of Responsive Gov's Remodeling Democracy project. What we're sort of doing here is not to sort of put a thumb on the scale in terms of we like a policy or don't like a policy. It's to sort of ask a series of questions, share with you all the kinds of questions we ask, and hear a bunch of sort of different perspectives from different experts across different modalities to hear about what they consider when they consider sort of whether to deploy a policy. So when we think about ranked choice voting, I'm just going to say like a few sort of words of table setting. Again, this is not a sort of policy where we have a one-size-fits-all policy solution across the country. It's an example of a policy we like in some places and not in others. Like I said, is sort of part of our remodeling democracy project. We like to think of this as blueprints, where you need to design a unique blueprint for every room of the house that you want to renovate. We think the same is true for states and localities, that as we sort of work to deploy structural reforms, we want to make sure that we're carefully tailoring the blueprint to the particular political culture, organizing culture, and implementing environment of any state. The second thing we want to sort of talk about today is that these structural reforms like ranked choice voting are reforms that change outcomes. They change election outcomes. They change political realities. That's their point. And so as we sort of think about where to deploy these, and we'll have some panelists talk about this, we need to think about how it changes outcomes and whether that's an outcome that we actually sort of desire. The next point is implementation. Those of you who know me well hear me talk about implementation at every step of the policy design process. Remodeling democracy is no exception to that. So you'll hear from several experts on implementation today about how we can think about how to implement this policy well, and what are some of the dangers when we don't get implementation right. And then the last thing before I sort of turn to our panel is I'd love folks to leave here today not just sort of thinking about more perspectives on ranked choice voting, but also thinking about sort of how we do policy. This kind of state-by-state approach, implementation-focused approach, is how responsive gov works. And in addition to just sort of talking about ranked choice voting, we wanted to give everyone this call a window into how we think about policy making. And we hope you sort of leave here today with a better sense of how we do our work. So right now, I'm going to kick it to my incredible panel here with me today. They're going to talk to you about sort of their perspectives on ranked choice voting, how it interacts with the work they do, some of the research they find, and how they bring their expertise to bear on how we think about whether and where to deploy ranked choice voting. So starting with Neal Ubriani is the Policy and Research Director at Institute for Responsive Government, where he helps states and local jurisdictions research, develop, and implement policy solutions to make government more effective, accessible, and responsive. Before coming to Responsive Gov, Neal was a voting rights litigator at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. We have Carolina Lopez, who, among other things, is the executive director of the Partnership for Large Election Jurisdictions, a membership association of the largest election jurisdictions across the country. Carolina is a former election administrator from Florida and an expert on how local election officials do their work and what they need to deliver the kind of elections that we need them to deliver. Noé Orozco is the program manager at Silver State Voices in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he oversees the voting rights, voter education, and rights restoration programs. Previously, he worked on census and redistricting for the Nevada Counts Coalition and has experience working with nonprofits, serving diverse groups of people, and connecting them with state and local resources. And then finally, we have Tiana Epps-Johnson, who needs no introduction, but is the chair of the board at the Institute for Responsive Government. She's also the founder and executive director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. She's leading a team that's doing groundbreaking work to make U.S. elections more inclusive and secure by supporting election departments across the United States. In 2020, when COVID pandemic collided with the presidential election, Tiana led a team that did a $350 million nonpartisan effort to prevent Election Day from becoming a super spreader event and ensure a smooth and secure process for voters nationwide. So I'm going to sort of ask each of the panelists some questions that, again, sort of will delve into their areas of expertise, their lenses, their backgrounds, and hear several different perspectives today on how and when we should be deploying this policy. But I'm going to start with Neal with a very simple question. Hey, Neal, what's RCV?
I think as the first panelist, I get the obvious question. So I think as most folks on this call know, but just for general background, ranked choice voting is a form of voting where voters rank candidates in order of preference, as opposed to just choosing one candidate. So instead of a ballot that says candidates are Tiana, Sam, Noe, Carolina, pick one, you would say, well, my first choice is Tiana. My second choice is Sam. My third choice is Noe. My fourth choice is Carolina. Sorry, Carolina, no offense. Um, and when the ballots are tabulated, they'll look to see if anybody has earned 50% of the vote among people's first choices. If nobody has 50%, the candidate finishing last is eliminated. And the people who voted for that fourth place candidate, in this case, Carolina, you would look to their second choice on their ballots. And those second choice votes would be allocated, and you would have a new round of tabulation. And if somebody gets 50% in that round, that person's elected. And this sort of tabulation proceeds in rounds until somebody gets 50% of the vote. Just to use an analogy that somebody gave me recently that I thought was useful, a sort of a traditional election is kind of like a multiple choice test, and a ranked choice voting is kind of like an essay question. You're saying, well, my first choice is X, but if my first choice doesn't win, then I want Y. And if my second choice doesn't win, then I want Z. And if Z doesn't win, then let's go back to A. So it's sort of a more nuanced perspective on voters' actual preferences. It's not just sort of a top line of here's the one candidate I vote for. It's sort of a full accounting of a voter's preferences among all the candidates.
And what are some of the benefits of RCV that a proponent might sort of start with when advocating for the policy?
So I think one of the highlights that people talk about is that it's a real way to honestly express your preferences. You know, it's a way to give more nuance to a person's vote. You know, in ranking your candidates, you don't need to choose between supporting somebody you prefer as your first choice and somebody who's really the more electable candidate. You can really be honest and say, well, this person's really my first choice, but if they don't win, I'm fine supporting this candidate as a second option. And so one thing people talk about is, you know, people are afraid to vote for third-party candidates or, you know, less prominent candidates because they're worried about voting for a spoiler candidate. With RCV, it's a way to cast your ballot for somebody who you think may not win, but who you honestly want to support. And then your vote can ultimately be reallocated to sort of the candidates who have the highest likelihood of winning. And I should add that there are sort of variations to RCV. You know, it's often paired with top 4 or top 5 primaries, where all the candidates run in an open primary, regardless of party, and the top 4 or the top 5 candidates advance to a general election. And then people use ranked choice voting for a general election with those top 4 or top 5 candidates. You can also just do it without top 4, and you can have people advance through party primaries, traditional party primaries, and then people rank candidates on the ballot who may be like a Democrat or Republican, a Libertarian, a Green Party. That's how it works in Maine, for example. I think another benefit that people talk about with RCV is that the winner has majority support in some form or another. So I'm a DC resident. We had an election here a couple of weeks ago for city council, and there were 10 candidates running in the primary, and it was basically like a 10-car pileup. The winning candidate got 23% of the vote and won with 23% of the vote. And that is not necessarily somebody who the majority of the electorate is supporting, but because people were splitting their votes 10 ways, somebody was able to prevail with 23%. And so with RCV, the votes would be reallocated until somebody prevails with, say, at least 50% of the vote in one of the rounds of tabulation. And one of the benefits of RCV is that you can do this without the need for a runoff. You don't need to have people, you know, you don't need to call the top 2 candidates and then hold a runoff between those 2 candidates, which is a whole separate election with additional costs. It can really sort of be done all at once. And then I think another benefit that people talk about is that this is a way to elect more moderate candidates. If, you know, the candidates who are being elected are sort of at the extremes, RCV can sort of push the electorate to the middle, to elect people who maybe aren't everyone's first choice, but they're acceptable to a majority of the electorate. They're at least somewhere on people's ballots, or a majority of people's ballots, as a least objectionable option for people.
And on the flip side, what are some of the potential drawbacks that you've encountered in your research?
So I think other panelists maybe going to highlight this, but just at a high level, I think, as you mentioned, Sam, there may be uh, a failure to think through all of the political implications. So as you mentioned, RCV and other sort of structural reforms to elections change political outcomes. And so how do those outcomes change? And thinking through, are those outcomes that you want to change versus sort of the status quo? I think folks ask about implementation concerns. There is some data that suggests that there's voter confusion, voter error. How can those concerns be addressed through effective implementation of the policy? I would say are some of the major concerns that folks raise.
What's the current state of play on RCV? Just briefly, sort of where are we seeing this moving?
Yeah, I was reading something that like the ballot initiative story of 2024 is reproductive rights, but the other ballot initiative story of 2024 is ranked choice voting. This is potentially moving as a ballot initiative in 8 states that I'm seeing, and in some states it's moving as a constitutional amendment potentially. So Nevada, it's on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Montana is on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Colorado on the ballot as a statutory initiative. Oregon also a statutory initiative. Arizona potentially a constitutional amendment. Idaho has a statutory ballot initiative. There's a move in Alaska to repeal RCV. I should have mentioned this earlier. Alaska and Maine are the 2 states that use RCV for state legislative elections and some federal elections. And in Washington, D.C., there's also a push to adopt it as a statutory ballot initiative.
And so this sort of sounds like this is sort of moving in a 50-state or sort of nationwide manner. Like, do you think that makes sense?
The title of this briefing was, RCV problematic or panacea, and I think that's an oversimplification. I think the answer is neither. RCV makes sense in some states, and it may be better to proceed with caution in other states. It's not a 0-state solution. It's not a 50-state solution. And I think one of the things that we're going to talk about in this briefing today is what considerations make it a better fit in some states than others. And to sort of answer my own question there, and I think the other panelists will answer this, is, are there folks on the ground who are thinking through implementation concerns and taking those seriously, thinking through how is this actually going to function? Who's going to be the people who are going to be implementing this? Is there funding for implementation? Are people thinking through the political implications? I mentioned that RCV may be a way to elect more moderate candidates. If you're a state that elects progressive candidates and you like your progressive candidates, should RCV be the right fit in your state? I think is a good question to ask. I think another really important question to ask is, do the groups on the ground support it? Are the groups that are sort of working actively every day on organizing voters and engaging in political reform, are they the people who are sort of in support or pushing these initiatives? Or is this just a situation where a billionaire has wandered into your state and is dropping a lot of money on a ballot initiative? And then I think a fourth question to ask is, should this be in the state constitution? This is, Sam described this as remodeling democracy, and it's important to have a blueprint. And I think it's important to ask, is this something that can be amended as needed, or is this something that the state's going to be locked into long-term that's very hard to change going forward?
Thanks, Neal. I'm going to turn, Tiana, I'm going to turn to you to talk about, I think, the concern that was sort of raised, I think, most in Neal's portion about sort of implementation. And I'm going to sort of use that to start off. So you lead the Center for Tech and Civic Life. You've talked a lot about how CTCL sort of doesn't take policy positions. You are not a sort of policy person. For lack of a better way to ask this, what are you doing here? Why are you on this panel?
Well, first, of course, I wanted to have the incredible Neal as a hard act to follow, because I just like to do hard things in a late Friday afternoon, but also because as someone who considers themselves an implementer, I get to work with election departments across the country to really make sure that they're well prepared to deliver a process of voting that works for all of their voters. And so when there is any do voting reform or policy that impacts the election experience for voters. It's something that we are interested in understanding the contours of and being able to understand best practice to support election departments in their actual implementation of the election process so it works best with voters. And I think when I think about ideally what ultimately any intervention around election reform might offer is a process that is easy to understand, is a process that voters are able to navigate with ease, and is a process that contributes to their confidence. And so that's really the lens that I bring when thinking about how we go from policy to practice in election administration.
So with that lens, I'm going to sort of ask you about like ranked choice voting ballots and the voter experience, casting a ranked choice voting ballot. And obviously sort of RCV ballots are by design more complex. Voters are being asked to sort of vote for multiple candidates in a given race, not just one candidate. The ballots are longer, literally wider, taller. Sort of a question I think that we need to answer is there a trade-off between sort of complexity and voter error or voter confusion? And so as a sort of implementation and election administration expert, do you think that RCV can confuse voters or potentially cause more ballot errors?
Yeah, so, as an individual, I am very interested in and find compelling many of the election remodeling reforms, including reforms like RCV. But as someone who is a practitioner who is concerned about the nitty-gritty of the implementation of the election process and the ways that voters engage with it, I do have some concerns and really open questions about voter confusion in particular when it comes to interacting with a ranked choice voting election. I think something that recently caught my attention was some research that came out of UPenn in 2023 that showed that about 5% of ranked choice voters interacting with a ranked choice ballot improperly mark the ballot. And that when you look at a comparison between voters' completion and error rates on a ballot that has a ranked choice election versus a single choice election, they found two things that I think are really important to dig into. One, that overvotes were 14 times more likely on that ranked choice ballot versus the single vote ballot. And also that there was a 10 times greater rejection rate with the ranked choice ballot. And so that's a place where I would, really want to dig in on what it looks like to understand what is the disconnect between the policy itself and the voters' experience of that policy. I think the one other thing that comes to mind when it comes to voters' experience navigating ranked choice voting is that there is some evidence that voters that share certain characteristics have a differential experience of ranked choice voting than other voters that don't share those same characteristics. And some of those are things that impact the voter experience across other types of election administration. Some of these shared characteristics are, for example, voters who are in areas that have a low income, places with higher minority populations, voters that have a lower level of education, and folks that navigate or prefer to navigate the process in languages other than English. When there are particular differences or segments of the population that might have differential experiences navigating a particular reform, that also becomes a place where it feels really incumbent to dig deep and understand the types of implementation support that's required in order for it ultimately to be maximally successful for voters.
So would you say that like RCV accurately captures voter? I think this is one thing that we really sort of struggled with when looking at RCV as a policy, is the sort of like theoretical point about whether this does a better job of implementing democratic outcomes in practice. Like, do you think that RCV accurately captures voter preferences?
I think that this is one of the places where there's definitely nuance. I think Neal spoke to some of the ways that a ranked choice ballot allows for a more nuanced expression of voter preference. But when we look at the experience of voters, this is another place where some voters have experience more confusion or a harder time completing a ranked choice ballot than other voters. For example, there was a recent study in the state of New Mexico that found that 16% of voters in ranked choice voting elections were somewhat or very confused by the process, and that there were significantly higher rates of those who met those high levels of confusion that were Latino voters. And so that is a place that, again, sort of begs the question or requires some examination about how voters are actually interacting with a reform or a remodel like this, and what types of additional support might be necessary to be able to actually get to the full benefits of these types of interventions. I think the one other thing that I am interested in that is often less of the concern of election administrators, but is one of the indicators that's important to me when I think about the health of democracy is the number of people that are actually participating. And that's another place where there is some conflicting evidence, at least of what I've seen. There have been some instances where academics have found that there has been a drop in turnout rates in ranked choice voting elections. And I think some of the sort of understanding of what might be going on there is the idea that a process that is less clear or more complex is discouraging to especially first-time or infrequent voters.
So one of my favorite things about your work, Tiana, is that it like draws through lines between things like implementation and the election administrator's experience and all of the sort of like voter-centric metrics that you just talked about. And as someone who like talks to election administrators across the country and has sort of networks in the election administration and implementation community, how much thought and effort is being put into RCV implementation right now, and what would you sort of want to see there?
Yeah. At a recent gathering of election officials, election administrators were sharing some of the things that they were most concerned about or most needed support on. The number one thing was election funding. That is what we find everywhere. But really top on that list was also a lot of election officials anticipating that ranked choice voting might be something that is a policy that they would be required to implement in their jurisdictions, and being interested in or concerned about the level of support that they have to be able to actually meet those implementation demands. When we're thinking about some of the core things that have to be considered when we are talking about the implementation of a change like ranked choice voting, things that are on the table are things like ballot design and voter education. And so I think that some of the challenges that we've seen around voter confusion that I mentioned as a little bit earlier, they're not insurmountable and are the types of things that over time and with the right investment and with the right level of planning and education that voters can certainly be helped through. But that requires a real laser focus on the piece around implementation and the support of election administrators. And most importantly, any policy that requires updates to systems, practices, communication, and the way that voters experience their own casting of a ballot. This can't be an unfunded mandate. There has to be the monetary support so election administrators can actually make the updates to their systems, practices, and technology to be able to successfully support voters in this process. I think my last reflection is that I ask a lot is, what is this moment calling for? And I have some concerns that in a moment where we are really in a crisis of voter confidence, that some of the most important things that we can be doing is making sure that the ways that voters navigate the process is really clear, and also that and there's a really super clear understanding about how we get from ballots cast to results. And that's one of the reasons that I really question, like, is this the right moment to go to scale with an intervention that does impact how people understand the tabulation of results, given that we're in such a delicate moment. And so just a few things that I am watching, monitoring, and thinking about as the types of things that are emerging that election departments will need support on or need to consider in a ranked choice voting policy environment.
Thanks, Tiana. I'm going to transition to Noe to talk specifically about one of the ranked choice voting proposals that Neal mentioned in Nevada. And we're so happy that you could join us today, Noe, because I think you bring the sort of perspective on a lot of the concrete perspective on a lot of the sort of things that Neal and Tiana were just talking about. And so when I think about where it's most critical to get quick election results in this country, like I think about Clark County, Nevada. I'm pretty sure that Nevada is going to be a tipping point in a presidential election this fall, and waiting 3 or 4 weeks for results out of Nevada seems like a suboptimal outcome to me. But I think this is sort of a great example of the flip side of what Neal mentioned. So Alaska is a ranked choice voting policy that, in part because of the sort of implementation and political context, we've been really supportive of at Responsive Gov. Nevada is something in part from feedback from organizers like you, we've been much more sort of concerned about. So Noe, can you sort of start with a basic intro of like what's currently going on in Nevada with ranked choice voting?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say, it's an honor being able to share some space with all the panelists and the hosts. So here in Nevada, we actually have, as Neal had mentioned, it is going to be a constitutional change if that were to be happening, but it is not happening by itself. So it's a ballot question 3. This is the second time around that it is being presented to the voters, and it is trying to do 2 things. The first thing is that it's trying to create open primaries, which would allow all of the primary for primary elections for all of the candidates to essentially appear in one ballot. And then from there, the top 5 would be advancing forward to the general election. And Neal had mentioned mostly it's a top 4, and then there are other variations. Here for Nevada, it would be a top 5. And then for the general election, it would be the ranked choice voting system. And I feel like it was actually a perfect segue for me to be coming in after Neal and Tiana, because they did touch upon a variety of different things that are just very applicable here to Nevada. One of the things that I feel is very unique in Nevada is that Silver State Voices leads a coalition of over 20 different community-based organizations, focus a lot on voting rights and ensuring that that Nevadan voters are able to exercise their ballot, their right to cast their ballot in the way that it's best for them. And one of the things that we in community with all of these community-based organizations, nobody was reached out to when the ballot question was initially introduced in 22. And then I believe it was about $20 million that were essentially put into the ballot question 3 when it was the first time go around in 2022. And about 17 million of those 20 million were from out of state. One of the things that we did talk about was that it wasn't so much that the individuals, the proponents of ballot question 3 needed to be consulting with the community-based organizations. But given that these organizations that we work with, the coalition that we lead, they're day in and day out knocking door to door in Nevadans, both in Southern Nevada and in Northern Nevada, and these organizations were never reached out to. So one of the biggest issues or concerns, I should say, that we Silver State Voices in the coalition do have is that it is a constitutional change. So if there needed to be any modification, any variation of the open primaries or ranked choice voting, we would have to go through this entire system again, which is it gets introduced and then you have to have it passed by Nevadan voters into subsequent elections. The other thing that I do feel, I quickly just want to mention is in Nevada, as well as, across the country, there is some level of distrust in the electoral process. And, I'm not saying that that's good, bad. People have that right to believe it or not. It's just the reality. A lot of individuals do feel that there is some level of a distrust, or that there's just very wariness about that electoral process. And I feel here in Nevada specifically that ranked choice voting would only exacerbate that. One of the things that I believe Neal has the one who had mentioned it at the very beginning, right, with, I guess, the naming of this panel, it was seen, would it be a panacea or not? And I feel that specifically here in Nevada, that's kind of how it was framed, where it was, this is going to fix the issues that are wrong with Nevada, or with being able to elect, candidates of choice in Nevada. And given that there's already that level of distrust or dislike within even just wanting to participate, if you are telling Nevadan voters, this is going to fix it, or go ahead and let's pass this and it's going to essentially fix whatever those issues are. And then 26 rolls around, maybe 28 rolls around, and we're already implementing it. And there's very, very little that has actually changed. That is going to, that's where for me, it's going to exacerbate it, because we were trying to present this as a panacea or as a fix all to everything that's wrong with Nevada politics. And that's simply not the case. Tiana is the one who had mentioned it's very, very, very nuanced. And there are a couple of other things that I'd be happy to share, but I'll go ahead and just stop right there.
Well, one thing that I would sort of love you to talk about is, I sort of these concerns are really sort of important to us, and we invited you to this panel in part because when Emily, who runs Silver State Voices, has a concern, I listen to that concern. I think we all think it's incredibly important to sort of listen to organizers in states and listen to political professionals in states when they raise concerns. I think one of the things that you and sort of Emily have raised is this will change political outcomes in Nevada. Do you think we're paying enough attention to that in the sort of policy analysis process that you're seeing?
No, I do not believe that we're focusing enough attention on that. As I had mentioned, right, it seems like, at least here in Nevada, I can't speak for the rest of the country, when framed at the very beginning, it was only the open primaries aspect of it. And so ranked choice voting was very like a second thought, maybe a tertiary thought, when discussing it with Nevadan voters and trying to get the signature gathering to make it appear on the ballot. And then when it passed in 2022, it was about like 53% of the vote. But there's a study that was done last year here in Nevada by the Gwynn Center. And in that study, it showed that even after it passed in 2022, and even after they've explained to the voters what question 3 was going to do, there was still about a third of the voters, or of the survey was showing that voters still didn't know what ballot question 3 was essentially going to be doing. And I feel that Tiana is the one who had mentioned it, that it's going to create some level of nuance. And I think that is very, very applicable here in Nevada, especially when we're considering voters whose first language is not English. And I think that that's one of the things that does not get discussed enough. And Tiana did mention it in terms of the voter education that needs to happen. So if I can just take a quick step back, in Nevada, we passed a bill to get rid of the caucuses, and now we go to a presidential preference primary. And the Nevada Secretary of State allocated, I don't remember how much money, but there was money allocated for voter education for the presidential preference primary that happened this year in February for the first time. And there was still so much confusion as to what was, how this process was going to work. And now going with the ranked choice voting aspect of it, in Clark County, where Las Vegas is, per the Voting Rights Act, every election material that is provided in English must be translated into Spanish and Tagalog. And in Nye County, which is a neighboring county to Clark County, every election material must be translated into the native Shoshone language, and that's a traditionally non-written language. So when we're looking at, it's going to, essentially create this ranked choice voting system, and everyone's going to be able to essentially figure out how it works, because you're just trying to figure out what do you want to have for lunch today or for dinner, and then you start ranking your options. It's not as simple as that, because if you're going to have a pizza, what your favorite pizza place is going to taste like. You're not going to know that candidate Tiana's issues are on reproductive justice, right, for example. And so it's not as simplistic as that. And whenever you're starting to translate all this material, it is going to get complicated very quickly. I believe New York City had allocated what was about 15 million when they had implemented it for voter education, and there was still a large amount of ballots that were rejected or spoiled ballots. And just very quickly, with regards to even redistricting, when it was happening here in Nevada, there was 3 different jurisdictions that were trying to translate the word redistricting. And like I mentioned, we work with community-based organizations that are in Washoe County, which is where Reno is, as well as here in Las Vegas. And now we had to try to figure out what were these 3 different terms that were going to be describing redistricting. And so I think we definitely do need to put pause and figure out what is this system going to look like before we go ahead and just implement it and then figure it out, or say it's going to essentially just kind of calibrate by itself. So in terms of like that political outcome, I do feel that there's not enough attention that is being focused on there.
And then the last question for you, again, this is sort of, I want to make sure to highlight some of the questions that I've heard from organizers in Nevada. Silver State Voices obviously is an organization led by organizers of color working on behalf of voters of color. How do you sort of worry about how this impacts candidates of color, particularly in Nevada?
Sure. So, one of the things that I do feel that I believe Neal is the one who had mentioned it at the very beginning, where that essentially it's good. Ranked choice voting is going to try to get somewhere down towards where the more moderate candidates are. And I mean, here in Nevada, after the 2020 census, Nevada is ranked as the third most diverse state in the country with respect to its AAPI population. We're ranked fourth in the country. And then with respect to the Latino population in the state, we were ranked fifth in the country. And so I do feel that having ranked choice voting could potentially be a little bit detrimental to being able to elect these candidates of choice. When you look at just within the primary system and how it is right now, a candidate of choice could be able to squeeze by through the primary election, and then once they get to the general election, they would be able to get the support of whatever political affiliation that they are associated with, or maybe even with the larger community. And so I do feel that is one of the things that we do not focus enough about. And in terms of ranked choice voting, I do know that, as was mentioned earlier, Alaska was one of these states that had implemented it. And the example that always does come out of Alaska is Representative Mary Peltola. And I do feel that for that, she did a phenomenal job of, using the system that was in place for her. But I don't feel that it was because of ranked choice voting that she was able to get elected. I think it was much more of a just good campaign strategy that she was able to use so that she could get elected. And I mean, I think here in Nevada, as I had mentioned, with regards to the AAPI community, before the 2022 election, which was before redistricting had happened, I believe we might have had two states representatives that identified as AAPI after redistricting happened. And even within the current system that we have, now there is an AAPI caucus in the state legislature. I believe it's 5 members of the AAPI caucus in the state legislature. And I think just going back to the Panacea aspect of it, we can't just try to look at it as siloed of we need to do ranked choice voting and that's going to resolve everything. I think we need to look at it in a more holistic, aspect of the redistricting aspect, the census aspect. And so all of these things are interconnected. And I'm not saying that everything has to happen all at once, but we do need to be very mindful when we are trying to implement some of these changes.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for providing that Nevada perspective. I think the one sort of takeaway here, putting on my 501c4 hat for a second on behalf of Responsive Gov Action, is that we literally just need to sort of think about the political outcomes that we're likely to achieve here. And so in 2022, Nevada reelected the only Latina senator in the entire country. Given the sort of third-party conservative votes in a ranked choice voting system, she probably would have lost. And so those brass tacks political outcomes are incredibly important to sort of making sure that we're not breaking the kitchen when we should be remodeling it. To sort of the flip side of that question, Noah, you mentioned Alaska. I want to kick it to Carolina, a sort of national expert in election administration and politics, to talk us through where are some of the places you see sort of RCV making sense, and what makes it make sense in those places?
There's lots of places. I mean, obviously we've heard about Alaska, right? And just wanted to sort of hone on this point, how it happened. In Alaska, you had, the proposal actually came from the groups on the ground, right? This was part of a multi-pronged strategy to elect certain candidates, right? It helped candidates of color succeed. You've heard from Neal in DC, right? Where there's just a benefit to just having a better say. You have Maine, and in Maine, just wanted to be clear that prior to RCB, several governor's races were actually determined by third-party candidates then, and this sort of led to the modern version of RCB after several lawsuits, to be fair, and revisions, where RCB applies to state-level primaries, federal general elections, as well as some, municipal elections, not quite yet for state general elections. And it's only used if there's like 3 or more candidates, including declared write-ins, right? So like there's different examples where that's working really well. I'm really excited about, say, Portland, where they are actively implementing RCB, and they're going from 3 districts to 12 districts, and they're going to do them all at RCB, right? So there are opportunities where RCB has worked really well, and there are other opportunities where sometimes implementation hasn't been as clean, and perhaps that has given other election administrators some pause in how they're going to be tasked with implementing RCB.
You're on mute, Sam.
I am on mute. Carolina, what would you sort of like advise in terms of a sort of national approach here? Should this be like, how should proponents think about targeting this policy?
So this is coming from, I'm going to preface the modeling statement with the following. I've administered over 200 elections in my day. I have worked with C3 and C4 groups in the past. I am the election official whisperer. And so coming from that angle, I'm per se agnostic to RCB, right? But I can tell you these are the sorts of questions that keep coming up time and time again. Local election offices do not make the decision to transition to RCB. However, they are very much tasked with implementing it seamlessly and are held at task if they don't do it. Just Google Alameda County, just Google New York City, right? Like one little mix up and it destroys everything you've done for months, years to prepare for this one significant change in the way you vote. Some of the questions that I get asked are, how does RCB interact with like ballot rejection rates overall and for different demographics, age groups, et cetera? How does that impact total turnout? How does that impact risk limiting audits? Let's talk pre-processing versus election day processing. Maybe just general voter confusion. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I found myself explaining the same description of how elections worked in my county, whether you're a reporter, a voter, or a key stakeholder, let alone if we were changing the voting system completely. With election offices, and I think Tiana sort of hinted at this earlier, with local election offices already way underfunded, and I won't bore you with those details, and highly scrutinized, and I won't bore you with those details, but just Google election in your state and you'll see what I mean. I highly recommend just the benefit of time, resources, and a lot of dry runs. And here's what I mean, right? Time to study. If I was a local election official sort of trying to figure out an answer to my legislature or my county board or my city board, can we do this? How do we do this? What do you need? I would want to talk to folks that have done this for some time. I would want to talk to folks that are doing it right now so I can learn real time. Okay, my robust, public outreach plan needs to hit all these points. I need funding, right? I'm thinking about LA County, who does not have RCB, but they did roll out a new voting system that they designed from scratch. And the amount of time that it took to get community input in the process of how it was going to work and how it was going to look, and then testing it massively so that folks would feel really comfortable was really a work of art. And despite rolling it out during COVID, they were successful and they have a high satisfaction rate. So you get what you put in. So if folks are thinking of this, if you're thinking of advocating this with your local legislators or your local election offices, one, talk to them first would be my advice. And two, once you've gotten their feedback, also consider that changing the voting method is not the only thing happening. You have wildly changing laws. You have, just changes both in Republican and Democratic states, and local election officials are already implementing 300, 400, 500 changes altogether. And I can tell you that this is an industry where we would usually change one thing, run an election, learn how it impacted voting, and then you would tweak something else. And here we're opening the floodgates, right? So just timing, I think, is really important. And provided that there's proper funding for robust voter education, I might even recommend like small pilot programs, not in a presidential election, with lots of municipal runs. So anyway, that's sort of what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump into some questions just so we make sure we have time to answer folks' questions. We have a little over 10 minutes for that. Please put questions, if you have any of them, into the Q&A. We'd love to sort of get to those before we wrap. I'm going to start with two questions that I think may have a sort of related answer. So I'm going to ask them both at once, and then see if Neal or any of the other panelists wants to sort of chime in with an answer. The first one is from Nancy. For the majority of elections, I think the benefits of RCV outweigh the drawbacks, but I see a significant difference between the straightforward argument for single winner races, that the winner should have a majority of voters, versus multi-winner races, like a city council at large race, where the winners, even with ranked choice voting, may not have a majority. Can you discuss that? And then I want to sort of add another question onto that, which is from an anonymous attendee. Love this discussion. Great, I do too. I feel like I had a lot of these questions before and it never got discussed. The current system of voting seems flawed in representing people's preferences. So isn't it worth trying RCV to at least avoid the current problems of first past the post? These are sort of both about representation and how we sort of actually implement democracy in practice. So Neal, wondering if you have any thoughts on either of those questions.
Yeah, those are both great questions. And the answers, I think, are complex. I think in the context of multi-winner races versus single-member races, I think it's important to note that RCV doesn't sort of solve the gerrymandering problem. You're still going to have single-member districts with RCV. And so sort of moving beyond single-member districts to elect multiple candidates for a district, like multi-member districts, that's something that a reform like proportional representation is really a great way to address. And so, the multi-winner races that Nancy is talking about, proportional representation may be a great solution there. And in terms of even moving beyond RCV in single-member districts, if the state, rather than having RCV in 50 single-member districts, you could have a state legislature elected by proportional representation, which may be ultimately be a fairer outcome. I think the question from the anonymous attendee about, RCV versus first past the post, I think it's really a nuanced question. There are obviously many circumstances where RCV is better than first past the post. We keep coming back to the DC City Council example, but it is really a perfect example. Maybe people should be winning with 23% of the vote. But I do want to hit on a point that Noah was making about situations where the outcomes that we get with first past the post may ultimately be preferable to the ones we get with RCV. So Noah mentioned a situation where a district, has a large community of color, but it's not necessarily the majority of the population. Maybe a candidate of color wins a Democratic primary, and then there's enough Democratic support in the general election where that candidate of color prevails, and there's more representation in the legislature. If you were to move to a top 4 or a top 5 primary where, there's a wider variety of candidates in that election, that pathway to power that exists under first past the post for that candidate of color is much less clear. And so in terms of moving from a system that, reliably elects candidates of color to one where there's more uncertain outcomes, I think is a situation where there's more nuance here, and RCV is not necessarily universally better as an outcome, depending on the outcomes that you care about than first past the post.
And then Neal, I'm just going to throw in Ryan Snow added a question that I think sort of adds on to that answer. Can you talk about RCV in larger multi-member districts, especially as it relates to being a remedy for vote dilution under Section 2 of the VRA?
That's a great question. I think RCV can be used as a remedy for racial vote dilution in multi-member districts. So if you look at United States versus East Point, the Department of Justice used RCV, really single transferable vote, which is a version of RCV that's used in multi-member districts as a remedy there, as a way to elect candidates of choice. I would say that RCV is less clearly a remedy for you know, vote dilution in single member districts. You know, I would say it's a way for the majority vote to overcome minority vote. So if say a community of color is splitting their votes among multiple candidates, RCV may be a way to have the community of color mass behind a single candidate of choice, allowing them to prevail in the district is probably a good way to describe it.
Thanks so much. I think we have a question from Rob Ritchie that we want to make sure to answer, who's interested in engagement with 3 resources. We'll sort of move those into the answered portion so folks can click on them, but it's some United America and Fair Vote resources on research about RCV and racial minorities, how RCV works with risk limiting audits, overvote data, and then how it sort of works with women. I'm going to sort of kick it to Tiana in a second to maybe address some of the implementation questions that are raised in these resources. Mostly just want to say, Rob, thanks for providing those. My perspective on this is that I think we're in a situation where there's a lot of academic research that shows one thing, and then a lot of academic research that shows the sort of precise opposite with regard to ranked choice voting. And they're sort of good examples of both outcomes here. And to me, again, sort of, I think our point with this entire briefing is that it makes sense to proceed with caution. And where we're sort of seeing competing academic studies, I think it's really important to think about sort of the mechanisms in real life and real politics in particular that produce those outcomes. And so in Nevada, for example, Noah, you should feel free to sort of jump in on any of this, but when we're thinking about the sort of general research about RCV and racial minorities, we should be talking to the organizers who organize voters of color in Nevada. We should be talking to the political experts in a place like Nevada to figure out what that effect is going to be. Because oftentimes, in my experience, those political experts and organizers have a sort of better sense than sort of academics who disagree with each other. Noah, would you add anything to that before I kick it to Tiana?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yes. I mean, I had already previously mentioned it, right? Where here in the state of Nevada, like none of these organizations, the over 20 different coalition members that we have were reached out to ask like, hey, we know that you are door-to-door knocking day in and day out. Have you heard any concerns, any thoughts? Or even this is an idea that we are considering. We would love to have it be a collaborative effort right from the start. And that's not what ended up happening here in the state of Nevada. Once it ended up getting the significant signatures and it was getting ready to get onto the ballot, that's when they decided to incorporate a couple of these organizations saying, would you like to jump on in support of question 3? And then just the very last thing that I will mention on that is, I don't believe that Nevada is very unique in this sense, but in 2022, there was a county commission seat that was decided by 10 votes. Not, you know, by 10 literal votes. And if we're talking about the ranked choice voting aspect and the spoiled ballots or the rejection that happens, 10 votes is going to be, you know, significant. I mean, if you're getting, you know, 15, 20 people, signatures that are being, or not signatures, ballots that are being spoiled, you know, that's enough to pretty much sway a district one way or another. And I do feel that Nevada is not unique in that sense. You know, I'm just highlighting it because it's very applicable to us. And that's why, you know, for right now, we were saying it was not a no period ranked choice voting is horrible. It's just the way that it was brought forward is where we didn't completely agree. And the fact that it is trying to enshrine it into the Constitution.
And just because I can't help myself, the county commission that Noe mentioned is the one that hires the director, the election director, the registrar of voters in Clark County, who's probably going to have more of an effect over who wins the presidential election this fall than any other official in the entire country. So those 10 vote races have an incredible effect. Tiana, before we close, do you want to sort of address any of the sort of questions about implementation resources? Thanks for the Center for Civic Design flag in the chat.
Just in addition to the resources that Rob shared that address some of the considerations about implementation when it comes to things like ranked choice voting, I also dropped some resources that are developed by the Center for Civic Design that look at some of the considerations around voter education, designing ballots, election results, and how to interact with news sources to present those results that are some of the work that they and others have done around sort of bridging that gap between policy and practice. I think one of the things that then becomes the important next step is really making sure that these best practices can get to election departments that need to be able to implement them, and that they have the monetary resources to actually move forward with these shifts.
Thanks so much, Tiana. There's some other great questions around some, like, especially some specifics on sort of open primaries versus sort of top 4 and 5. And we're so happy to sort of think about those questions. I don't think we're gonna have time to answer them today, but I just want to sort of bring them up because I think there are sort of endless policy details here that we can and should be continuing to consider and iterate on and carefully sort of target to the right places, as the panelists said today. I was wondering if maybe we could close. We have 2 minutes left, so everyone gets limited to truly 1 sentence max. What is like 1 sentence that you would like the folks watching this panel to take away today about sort of from your lens on RCV or from your lens on policymaking? Start with Neal.
I think I would just say consider the context. There with 8 states considering RCV this fall, it seems like this is moving very fast, and to just take sort of a moment to ask, is RCV the right fit for your state? It may be, but it's important to ask that question.
No way.
Very, very similar to that, where it's just figure out if it's applicable or if it makes sense to you and your jurisdiction. Here in the state of Nevada, we felt it's not a no, period, no, never. It's a no, not right now. And then let's see if we can get to a yes, ensuring that everything is, that we have enough guardrails so that it just doesn't end up, unraveling.
Carolina.
Ask the locals, ask the local election officials if they have the equipment that can fit it, or if they need to go buy more equipment. Ask the local community stakeholders who are going to be educating the voters. Ask the local folks before you communicate with statewide folks would be my advice.
Tiana.
Winning the campaign is the first step, but getting to impact is that work of actually doing the implementation. And so really being able to focus and make sure that that piece is meeting the ultimate goals of the intervention is the most critical to my mind.
And with that, I'm just going to implore folks to call the folks on this panel, call experts in organizing, politics, and election administration when you sort of want to consider remodeling democracy. Thank you so much to our excellent panel today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I know I learned a lot today. Appreciate the folks who joined us today and our panel very, very much. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Bye.